November 25th, 1177, somewhere near the village of Montgisard in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. A 16-year-old boy sits on a warhorse, his face half covered by bandages to hide the lesions devouring his features. His hands are wrapped in cloth because the nerves are dying and he can barely feel the reins. He's King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, and he has leprosy, a disease that will kill him before his 24th birthday. Right now, he's staring across a dusty plain at approximately 40,000 Saracen warriors commanded by Saladin, the most brilliant Muslim general of the age. Baldwin has 1,200 knights. That's it. No infantry reinforcements. No time to call for help. No strategic withdrawal option, because Saladin's army is positioned between Baldwin's tiny force and Jerusalem itself. The boy king makes a decision that violates every principle of medieval warfare. He orders a direct cavalry charge into the center of an army that outnumbers him 33-1. His Templar knights think he's lost his mind. His advisors beg him to retreat while there's still time. Baldwin ignores them. He raises his sword, the same hand that will lose all feeling within months, and signals the charge. What happens next is so improbable that Muslim chroniclers will later claim it was divine intervention punishing Saladin's arrogance. In approximately 4 hours, 40,000 soldiers will be routed by a force less than 3% their size. Saladin himself will barely escape with his life. And a dying teenager will achieve the most lopsided military victory in Crusader history. This isn't a scene from Kingdom of Heaven. This is the Battle of Montgisard, and it's been forgotten because it doesn't fit the narrative that the Crusades were just European aggression against innocent Muslims. The reality is far more complex and far more brutal on both sides. Before diving into how a leper teenager humiliated the greatest general of his era, if you enjoy learning about the forgotten battles that shaped medieval history through tactical brilliance and desperate courage, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. The story of Montgisard deserves to be remembered. Here's what you need to understand about Baldwin IV before we get to the battle itself. He was diagnosed with leprosy at age 9. Medieval leprosy wasn't just a death sentence, it was a living nightmare. The disease destroys nerve endings, leaving victims unable to feel pain. That sounds like a blessing, until you realize it means you can't tell when you're injuring yourself. Baldwin couldn't feel when his hands were burned or cut. He couldn't feel infections developing in his feet. By age 16, he was already experiencing the facial deformities and partial paralysis that would eventually consume him. Traditional medieval thinking said lepers were cursed by God and should be exiled to leper colonies to die in isolation. Baldwin was crowned king anyway. Not because the Kingdom of Jerusalem was desperate, though they were, but because his father Amalric I died suddenly in 1174 and Baldwin was the legitimate heir. The Haute Cour, the council of nobles who effectively ran the Crusader kingdoms, debated whether to set aside the succession. Some argued a leper couldn't command respect or lead armies. Others pointed out that Baldwin, despite his disease, had already demonstrated intelligence and courage beyond his years. The debate ended when Baldwin himself appeared before the council, removed his bandages, and said words that were recorded by the chronicler William of Tyre. "I did not choose this disease. God chose it for me. I will serve him and Jerusalem until this body fails completely." The council voted to crown him. It was a decision born of necessity and tradition, but it created something unexpected, a king who knew he was dying and therefore had nothing to lose. That kind of fatalism makes men dangerous on the battlefield. Shift your perspective to Saladin's position in late 1177. He's 39 years old, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and he's been systematically conquering Crusader territories for 3 years. He's already captured multiple fortresses and beaten Crusader armies in conventional engagements. His strategic goal is simple: recapture Jerusalem and drive the Frankish invaders into the sea. Saladin is not the noble, chivalrous figure that later European romantics made him out to be. He's a pragmatic military commander who uses psychological warfare, scorched earth tactics, and mass executions when it suits his purposes. He's also brilliant at logistics and intelligence gathering. In November 1177, Saladin learns that the bulk of the Crusader military forces are engaged in a campaign far to the north near Syria. the kingdom of Jerusalem's defenses are at their weakest point in years. Saladin assembles an invasion force estimated at between 26,000 and 40,000 warriors. Sources vary, but even the conservative estimates put his force at around 30,000 troops. This includes Mamluk heavy cavalry, Turkish horse archers, Egyptian infantry, and Bedouin skirmishers. He crosses into Crusader territory through the Sinai Peninsula, bypassing the heavily fortified Gaza strongpoint by simply going around it. The plan is to raid deep into Crusader territory, burn the agricultural lands that feed Jerusalem, and possibly besiege Ascalon or even Jerusalem itself if the opportunity presents. Saladin isn't expecting serious resistance because his intelligence reports tell him the Crusader armies are weeks away from being able to respond. He's right about that. What he doesn't know is that Baldwin IV, despite being barely mobile due to his disease, has assembled every knight he can scrape together and is riding south to intercept him. Baldwin's force consists of approximately 1,200 mounted knights. Let's be very clear about this composition. These are fully armored heavy cavalry, men wearing 60 to 80 pounds of mail and plate armor, riding warhorses bred specifically for shock combat. Each knight represents years of training and enormous economic investment. A knight's equipment, armor, weapons, horse, costs more than a peasant farmer will earn in a lifetime. These 1,200 knights are essentially the kingdom of Jerusalem's strategic reserve, the last mobile force available for defense. Baldwin also has around 80 Knights Templar led by their Grand Master, Odo de St. Amand. The Templars are a military religious order, warrior monks who have taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but whose definition of obedience includes charge into vastly superior enemy forces because God wills it. They're fanatics in the truest sense. They don't retreat, they don't surrender. They fight until they win or die. Odo de St. Amand is 57 years old and has been fighting in the Holy Land for over 2 decades. He's seen every type of combat scenario imaginable. When Baldwin explains his plan to charge Saladin's army head-on, Odo doesn't object. He just asks where the Templars should position themselves in the formation. I find it incredible that we're exploring these stories of desperate courage together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with battles where impossible odds were overcome through tactical genius and sheer audacity. Now, here's where the geography becomes critical. Saladin's army is marching north from Egypt through the coastal plain, aiming to strike inland toward Ramla and potentially Jerusalem. Baldwin's scouts report the Saracen position near a place called Montgisard, a small village approximately 30 miles south of Jerusalem. The terrain is relatively flat scrubland with low hills, perfect for cavalry maneuvers. Saladin has made a critical error. His army is spread out in marching formation rather than battle deployment. His scouts and forward skirmishers have been raiding villages and are scattered across miles of territory. The main body of his army is in column, not line, optimized for movement, not combat. Baldwin recognizes this is his only chance. If Saladin's army consolidates and deploys properly, no amount of courage will overcome a 30-to-1 numerical disadvantage. But if Baldwin can hit them while they're disorganized, while their formations are strung out along the march route, there's a microscopic chance of creating enough chaos to break their cohesion. It's not a good plan, it's just the only plan. November 25, 1177, approximately 9:00 a.m. Baldwin orders his 1,200 knights into formation. The standard Crusader cavalry tactic is the charge, form into dense formations resembling a spear point, build up maximum speed, and smash into the enemy line with overwhelming kinetic energy. The knights are organized into 3 divisions. The center is led by Baldwin himself, despite his condition requiring that he be partially strapped to his saddle to prevent falling. The right wing is commanded by Reynold of Sidon, a veteran knight known for aggressive tactics. The left wing and rear guard are the Templars under Odo de St. Amand. The knights form up behind a low ridgeline that conceals their position from the Saracen army. They can see the dust cloud from Saladin's marching column. They can hear the noise, thousands of men and horses moving, metal equipment clanking, voices shouting in Arabic. The Crusaders are outnumbered so badly that the sound of the enemy army is itself psychologically crushing. But Baldwin has one advantage Saladin doesn't expect: the element of surprise. Saladin's scouts have reported small Crusader forces in the area, nothing suggesting a major engagement is imminent. He believes Baldwin is still in Jerusalem, or moving slowly with whatever token force the teenage leper king can assemble. Saladin is about to learn that reports of his enemy's weakness were catastrophically wrong. Before diving into the actual combat sequence, consider checking out this next video on the screen about medieval cavalry charges and how they actually worked compared to Hollywood depictions. The physics and tactics of shock cavalry are far more sophisticated than movies show. You're a Mamluk cavalry commander named Rashid ibn Kamel. You're 34 years old, originally a slave soldier from the Caucasus region, now a respected officer in Saladin's army. You've fought in a dozen campaigns and you're good at your job. Right now you're riding near the front of the column, keeping loose formation as your unit moves north along the coastal plain. It's late morning. The sun is high and hot even in November. You're wearing a mail hauberk that weighs about 35 pounds, with a conical helmet and carrying a composite bow, a curved saber, and a small round shield. Your horse is tired from days of marching. You're thinking about where the army will camp tonight, whether the water situation will be adequate for this many men and animals. Then you hear something that doesn't belong. It's a low, rumbling sound, rhythmic and growing louder. It sounds like thunder, but the sky is cloudless. You turn your head toward the ridge to your east, squinting against the sun. The ridgeline erupts with horsemen, hundreds of them, armored from head to toe in metal that catches the sunlight like moving mirrors. They're formed into a dense wedge formation and they're already at full gallop, riding directly toward your position. You have approximately 30 seconds to process what's happening and react. The distance is maybe 600 yards and closing rapidly. Crusader heavy cavalry at full charge covers ground at terrifying speed, roughly 35 miles per hour for a sustained sprint. You try to shout a warning to your unit. You try to wheel your horse around to face the threat. You see other Mamluk units around you attempting the same maneuvers. But you're in marching column, not battle formation. Men and horses are bunched together for efficient movement, not combat spacing. There's no room to maneuver, no time to organize a defensive line. The Crusader charge hits the Saracen column like a spear through flesh. The physics of a medieval cavalry charge are brutal. Each armored knight and his warhorse together represent roughly 1,800 to 2,000 pounds of mass moving at 35 miles per hour. The kinetic energy is devastating. When the charge makes contact, the Crusader lances, 12-foot wooden shafts tipped with steel points, punch through mail armor, through leather, through human bodies. The first rank of Saracen warriors simply disintegrates. Men are knocked from saddles, trampled, impaled. Horses collide with horses, and both go down in screaming tangles of breaking legs and thrashing bodies. The Crusader wedge formation is designed specifically for this moment. The point of the wedge, the most heavily armored knights, absorbs the initial shock. Behind them, subsequent ranks pour into the gap created, widening it, maintaining momentum. The wedge doesn't stop on contact. It keeps moving, driving deeper into the enemy formation, splitting it apart. The Templars are particularly devastating because they maintain absolute formation discipline even in the chaos of melee combat. They move as a single organism, protecting each other's flanks, maintaining the pressure that keeps the enemy from reforming. Saladin's army is caught in the worst possible scenario. The front elements are engaged in desperate close combat. The middle elements are trying to push forward to support the front, creating crushing density that makes organized fighting impossible. The rear elements don't even know battle has been joined yet. The Saracen army is effectively divided into segments that can't coordinate with each other. This is exactly what Baldwin gambled on, catching them disorganized and maintaining chaos long enough to break their cohesion. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast who appreciates the brutal reality of medieval warfare. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories of desperate victories alive. Let's be very clear about what medieval melee combat actually involves. It's not elegant sword duels like in movies. It's cramped, terrifying, and exhausting. You're wearing 60 pounds of armor in the Middle Eastern heat. Visibility through a helmet is limited. Hearing is muffled. You're breathing your own hot, stale air that smells like metal and sweat. Your arm muscles are burning from swinging a 3-pound sword over and over. Blood makes everything slippery. Wounded men are screaming in multiple languages. Horses are panicking and crushing anyone who falls to the ground. Baldwin IV is somewhere in the center of this nightmare, and he can barely feel the reins in his damaged hands. Historical sources record that he had to be physically supported by retainers who rode close beside him to prevent him falling from the saddle. But medieval chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, agree that Baldwin personally led the charge and was seen fighting in the thick of combat. For a 16-year-old with advanced leprosy, this is an almost incomprehensible feat of willpower. Most men his age with his condition would be bedridden. He's commanding a cavalry charge against odds that would terrify healthy veteran warriors. The initial Crusader charge penetrates approximately 2 miles into Saladin's column formation before the momentum finally begins to slow. The Saracen center has collapsed, but now the wings are beginning to envelop the Crusader force. Saladin, who was riding with the middle of his army column, suddenly finds himself in direct combat. His personal guard, elite Mamluks sworn to defend him to the death, forms a defensive position as Crusader knights push toward the Sultan's position. Here's where we get one of the most dramatic moments in the entire battle. A Templar knight, sources don't record his name, only that he carried the order's black and white banner, breaks through Saladin's guard and gets within striking distance of the Sultan himself. Medieval combat between fully armored opponents is usually decided by whoever lands the first solid hit that penetrates armor or finds a gap. The Templar swings his sword in an overhead cut aimed at Saladin's head. Saladin blocks with his shield. The impact is so powerful it splits the shield nearly in half and numbs Saladin's arm. The Sultan's bodyguards swarm the Templar and drag him from his horse. He disappears under a wave of blades. Saladin realizes at this moment that his army is not just engaged in battle, it's being destroyed. The panic is spreading. Muslim chroniclers who fought at Montgisard later describe a supernatural terror that gripped the army, a feeling that they were being struck down by divine punishment. Modern analysis suggests what actually happened was a cascading morale collapse. When soldiers see their formations breaking, their comrades fleeing, and their commanders unable to restore order, ancient survival instincts override training and discipline. Panic becomes contagious. The Saracen army begins to rout. This isn't an organized withdrawal. This is 30,000 plus men deciding simultaneously that survival means getting as far from this battlefield as possible by any means necessary. The rout transforms the battle from a military engagement into a slaughter. Routing soldiers drop weapons and shields to run faster. They abandon wounded comrades. They clog roads and trample each other trying to escape, and Crusader cavalry pursues, cutting down fleeing men whose backs are turned and who can't defend themselves. This is where medieval warfare reveals its absolute cruelty. Medieval military doctrine held that the real killing happens during the pursuit of a routed enemy. An intact formation with weapons and discipline can defend itself even while retreating. A panicked rout is just targets running away. The Crusader knights chase Saladin's fleeing army for miles, killing with mechanical efficiency. There's no glory here, no honorable combat, just exhausted knights hacking down unarmed men begging for mercy in a language the Christians don't understand. Casualty figures from medieval battles are always uncertain, but multiple sources, both Crusader and Muslim, agree that Saladin's losses at Montgisard were catastrophic. Estimates range from 20,000 to 30,000 dead, with many more wounded or captured. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Asir, who wasn't at the battle but interviewed survivors, wrote that Saladin escaped with fewer than 3,000 men from an army that had numbered over 30,000. Even if we assume these numbers are exaggerated, medieval chronicles often were, the kill ratio is staggering. The Crusaders lost somewhere between 150 and 300 knights, depending on the source. That's still a ratio of at least 70 to 1 casualties in favor of the smaller force. Saladin himself barely escapes. He's reduced to riding a camel, his warhorse was killed in the fighting, and makes a desperate multi-day retreat back to Egypt with the remnants of his personal guard. Medieval Muslim sources describe his arrival in Cairo as shocking. The great Sultan, who left just weeks earlier at the head of a massive invasion force, returns broken and humiliated with barely enough men to constitute a bodyguard. It's one of the lowest moments of Saladin's entire career. He will recover, rebuild his armies, and eventually succeed in recapturing Jerusalem 11 years later in 1187. But he never forgets Montgisard, and he never again underestimates the Crusader kingdom's ability to produce desperate miracles. Consider hitting that like button if you're appreciating how tactical surprise and concentrated shock action can overcome seemingly impossible numerical odds when the enemy is caught unprepared and unable to bring their superior numbers to bear effectively. Baldwin IV returns to Jerusalem as a conquering hero. The city erupts in celebration when news of the victory arrives. For the people of the Crusader kingdoms, Montgisard is more than a military victory. It's a sign that God is protecting them despite their precarious position. The fact that a dying teenage leper king achieved this victory gives it enormous symbolic weight. William of Tyre, the primary chronicler for this period, describes Baldwin's return. The king entered the city borne on a litter, for his disease had advanced such that he could no longer sit a horse for long. Yet his spirit was unconquered, and the people hailed him as God's chosen instrument. The victory at Montgisard buys the kingdom of Jerusalem several years of relative security. Saladin spends 1178 and 1179 rebuilding his military forces and securing his political position in Egypt and Syria. He doesn't launch another major invasion until 1179, and even then he's more cautious. The psychological impact of the defeat lingers. Saladin's reputation as an invincible general has been shattered. His emirs and subordinate commanders question his strategic judgment. The victory allows Baldwin to consolidate his political position despite his worsening condition. But here's where the irony of history becomes tragic. Montgisard was the high point of Baldwin IV's reign. Over the next 8 years, his leprosy steadily destroys him. By age 20, he's blind. By 22, his face has deteriorated so badly that he wears a silver mask to hide the damage. By 23, he can no longer walk or ride and has to be carried everywhere on a litter. Yet he continues ruling, continues making military and diplomatic decisions, continues holding his fractious kingdom together through force of will. Medieval chroniclers describe him as the leper king who could not feel pain but felt every wound to his kingdom. Baldwin dies in March 1185 at age 23. His nephew, a 7-year-old boy named Baldwin V, briefly succeeds him but dies within a year. The succession crisis that follows, combined with Saladin's recovered strength, leads directly to the disaster at the Battle of Hattin in July 1187, where the Crusader field army is annihilated and Jerusalem falls back into Muslim control. Everything Baldwin fought for at Montgisard is undone within 2 years of his death. This brings us to one of the most overlooked aspects of the Crusades. Modern popular history tends to portray them as straightforward European aggression, with Muslims as victims defending their land, or conversely, as heroic Christian defense of the Holy Land. The reality is far more complex and far more human. Both sides committed atrocities. Both sides had moments of chivalry and brutality. Both sides were motivated by mixtures of religious devotion, political ambition, economic interest, and personal glory. Montgisard is forgotten partly because it doesn't fit clean narratives. It's a story of a dying teenager achieving the impossible through desperate courage and tactical gamble, but also a story of massive slaughter of fleeing men and the ultimate futility of the victory. Let me be absolutely clear about the tactical lessons from Montgisard. This wasn't divine intervention or lucky chance. Baldwin exploited multiple Saracen errors: overextended supply lines, poor reconnaissance, marching in vulnerable column formation through terrain that favored cavalry charges, and Saladin's underestimation of Crusader capabilities. The Crusader victory came from recognizing a brief window of opportunity and committing everything to that moment. The charge itself required near-perfect execution, maintaining formation cohesion, hitting the exact point of maximum enemy vulnerability, and sustaining momentum long enough to create irreversible panic. Modern military analysts study Montgisard as a case study in asymmetric warfare and shock tactics. The principles applied there: concentrate force at enemy weakness, attack before enemy can deploy effectively, maintain offensive pressure to prevent enemy recovery, appear in military doctrine from the Napoleonic era through modern mechanized warfare. Tank columns executing breakthrough operations in World War II followed essentially the same logic as Baldwin's cavalry charge: punch through the enemy line, drive deep into the rear areas, create chaos faster than the enemy can respond. But there's a darker lesson too. Montgisard shows how medieval warfare was a lottery where temporary tactical advantage could produce wildly disproportionate results. The Crusader kingdom survived Montgisard. It didn't survive Hatton. The difference wasn't courage or divine favor. It was which side got caught unprepared on which day. Baldwin understood this better than most. His dying letters to European monarchs begging for reinforcements have a desperate clarity. We won at Montgisard through God's grace and fortune's favor. But fortune is fickle, and we cannot count on miracles to sustain us forever. He was right. The miracle didn't sustain them. Now, the kingdom of Jerusalem's ultimate fate doesn't diminish what happened on November 25, 1177. 1,200 knights crushed 40,000 warriors through tactical brilliance and absolutely insane courage. A 16-year-old dying of leprosy led from the front and survived. Saladin, who would become legend as the Muslim commander who recaptured Jerusalem, fled the battlefield in humiliation on a borrowed camel. These facts remain regardless of how the story ended years later. If you want to understand the Crusades beyond the propaganda from either side, you have to grapple with battles like Montgisard. They don't fit neat narratives. They're messy, morally complicated, and reveal that medieval warfare was far more sophisticated than the popular image of armored barbarians hacking at each other suggests. The command decisions, tactical coordination, and logistical planning required to pull off what Baldwin achieved would challenge modern military forces. He did it with 12th century technology and while literally dying. This proves one thing: military genius isn't about resources or numbers. It's about recognizing the critical moment and having the courage to commit everything to seizing it. Baldwin had one chance. He took it. 30,000 of Saladin's soldiers paid the price for their commander's underestimation of a dying teenage king. Check out the next video on the screen about the Battle of Hattin and how Saladin got his revenge a decade later. The contrast between Montgisard and Hattin shows how quickly fortune reverses in medieval warfare and how Baldwin's successors failed to learn from his tactical lessons. Picture Baldwin IV in March 1185, lying on his deathbed in Jerusalem. He's 23 years old but looks ancient. The leprosy has consumed his face, his hands, his feet. He's blind. He can barely speak. His body is a rotting shell. And yet, in his final hours, according to William of Tyre, he asks for reports on the kingdom's defensive positions and troop readiness. Even at the absolute end, he's still the king who led 1,200 knights against impossible odds and won. I want you to remember Montgisard. Remember that a sick teenager achieved one of the most lopsided military victories in medieval history, not through superior numbers or resources, but through tactical audacity and absolute refusal to accept that numerical odds determine outcomes. Remember that both sides in the Crusades fought with courage and brutality, with religious conviction and political calculation. Remember that history is more complicated than hero and villain narratives allow. Most of all, remember that Baldwin IV fought and won at Montgisard knowing he was dying, knowing the victory might be temporary, knowing his kingdom would likely fall after his death. He did it anyway. That's the definition of courage, not fighting when victory seems certain, but fighting when you know the odds are impossible and doing it anyway because the alternative is surrendering without trying. 1,200 knights, 40,000 warriors, one dying king, 4 hours of combat. The Forgotten Miracle of Montgisard deserves to be remembered as one of the most extraordinary military achievements in human history, not because it changed the ultimate outcome of the Crusades, but because it proved that in war, as in life, outcomes aren't predetermined. The impossible becomes possible when someone refuses to accept the calculations that say they should give up. Baldwin IV never gave up, not when diagnosed with leprosy at age 9, not when crowned a dying king at 13, not when facing Saladin's invasion at 16. And not during the 8 years after Montgisard, when his body slowly failed while his will remained iron. He died having achieved something most healthy warriors never approach, defeating an enemy that outnumbered him 30-1 and living to return home in triumph. That's what makes Montgisard unforgettable. Not the casualty count or the tactical details, but the sheer audacity of a dying child king who saw an impossible situation and chose to charge straight into it rather than die without fighting. Modern warfare has changed completely. Medieval cavalry charges are museum pieces. But the principle Baldwin proved remains eternal. Courage combined with tactical intelligence can overcome odds that mathematics say are insurmountable. So when you hear about the Crusades, remember this battle. Remember the leper king who couldn't feel his hands but felt his kingdom's peril. Remember the 1200 who followed a dying teenager into combat against odds no sane commander would accept. Remember that on November 25th, 1177, everything military logic said should happen. The annihilation of the Crusader force didn't happen because someone refused to let numbers write the story's ending. Please hit subscribe if you want more forgotten stories, where desperate courage and tactical brilliance combine to produce outcomes that seem impossible in hindsight. The algorithm needs to know that history's most improbable victories have an audience that appreciates both the human drama and the military genius behind them. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem fought the perfect battle at Montgisard. He won decisively, and he still lost the war. That's the tragedy and the inspiration. Sometimes you fight knowing you'll ultimately lose. Sometimes you charge 30,000 warriors with 1,200 knights. Sometimes a dying teenager becomes the most dangerous opponent the greatest Muslim general of the age ever faces. Sometimes the impossible happens because someone refuses to calculate the odds before committing to the charge. That's the lesson of Montgisard. That's why it deserves remembering. That's why Baldwin IV's brief, doomed reign matters. He proved that courage and tactical genius can overcome impossible odds, even if only temporarily, even if the ultimate ending is tragic, even if history mostly forgets because the victory was followed by defeat. But for one afternoon in November 1177, 1,200 knights annihilated 40,000 warriors, and a dying teenage leper king rode through the wreckage of Saladin's shattered army, carried on a litter but victorious nonetheless. Remember that. Remember him. Remember Montgisard, the forgotten miracle that proved the impossible was possible.